Some people would call this an extremely fun topic. Some people would call this an extremely boring topic. The people that go to a party and sit in the corner and don't talk, those are the people who would say this is extremely fun. Now, I got to be careful about that because there's a piece of this that I think is extremely fun. So I'm kind of in that category sometimes because you can really nerd out on what are the basic scores, right? Scores, or let's just call it scores at this point in the conversation. What are scores for trucking companies, for motor carriers in the industry? That's the topic.
Oh, man.
We're going to try to demystify that. That is a hard thing to do.
We have an uphill battle for sure.
We absolutely do.
And we're not really the sit in the corner at a party kind of people. So somehow we're going to make this a little more interesting and fun than that, I hope. At least that's our goal. Otherwise, we'll both be asleep before the end of the episode.
Let's jump right in. Let me start with this. Welcome to the podcast that accompanies the DOT analysis platform, where we discuss real-time trends in the truck insurance market and explore answers to the questions you are not allowed to ask. I'm Ray.
And I'm Ben. And this is the Inside Lane. All right. So you mentioned in the setup there, Ray, that this is an uphill battle and a difficult topic to cover. But I tell you what, maybe we might as well just throw in teaching everybody how to play euchre on the episode today. I mean, if we're going to cover some of the world's most complicated topics, we might as well just hit them all in one, don't you think?
That's exactly a good idea. And let's name it something really simple to start with. We will call it the basic scores because they are anything but basic. But before we even get into that, here's a question that I always that comes up, whether it is directly asked of me or I see this question materialize in someone's mind and play out conversationally as I'm working with someone in the industry. It's this question: what's the story with the scores?
Yeah. Oh man, what a challenging and yet telling question. Like there's so much wrapped up in a question like that. And it just, to me, that highlights so much the ambiguity that exists. So man, you say like, what's the story? Well, the story is totally different depending on what your frame of reference is. What's the reason that you're even trying to understand the scores in the first place? I mean, in many cases, an underwriter has a very different perspective than the producer does. And for sure, the motor carrier. And then add to that generic term that you just used in the question of scores.
I did choose that specifically.
I know you did. You were trying to trick somebody there. But how generic of a term and how really worthless of a term, to just be really blunt.
It is absolutely worthless because people will say it in different contexts. And
to be clear, the word score is what we're saying because it's so generic.
The word score is very generic. Let me throw out a couple other not super helpful terms. Okay, you ready? So you can say score. You can say SMS score. You can say cab score. You could say MC score. You can say gap score. You can say the ubiquitous score. There's 100 other variations. Mm-hmm. What do those things actually, what do they mean? Right?
Yeah, so we want to cut through some of that mist and fog, I think, and try and bring clarity to the conversation a little bit. There are some truly definable terms.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
We want to bring clarity to what those terms are and what those definitions are so that we can speak with clarity on the topic. And in some cases, those terms you just mentioned, people use those and they are referencing one of those definable terms when they use that word. And so in that case, they think they know exactly what they're talking about, and they might. The person they're speaking to thinks they know exactly what they're talking about, and they might, but they've just introduced so much ambiguity into the conversation because what if you actually meant something different than the actual defined term there?
And I see that happen all the time in conversations where people will genuinely believe that they are talking on this with the same basis in mind, and they are talking completely past each other.
Yeah, totally missing it.
Yeah, unless you define your terms, you've got to understand. So, how about this? Let me start this way. I'm going to pull up our terms glossary here. We at DOT Analysis really care about being in the same place when we're talking about subjects that are this really important. And so I'm going to go to our website here, and if I click on resources, I'm going to go to terms glossary. And how about I just state
Well,
what
let me go through our setup for our episode here. We're going to walk through a list of questions that we've kind of synthesized down from numerous conversations across our client base and just in the industry at large. And so that first one is related to the basic scores. If you maybe want to start there, that first question is, who came up with or where did the basic scores come from? So let's look at what the basic scores, what that means. Because boy, talk about a misleading term. Can you get more misleading than calling these scores basic?
Yeah, exactly. So let's start right there. Basic, notice the word is all in capitals because it stands for behavior, analysis, and safety improvement categories. And we did not come up with that. No one in the industry, even in the insurance industry, came up with that. That came from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the FMCSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation at the U.S. government. So that's where these came from.
And who could possibly be better at calling something basic and then making it one of the most complicated and convoluted things you could understand than the federal government?
That's right. Which that's another one of the common questions is that we always see is who came up with the basic scores? Well, there's your answer. It was the government. They came up with these scores.
Yeah. So without getting too far into the weeds, just give a brief, where did that come from and why? Because it does provide good context that I think we're going to want to reference back to, but I want to try and steer a conversation around discussing the terms, but we have to have a little history here, because it's so insightful in unpacking what these scores actually mean and how they work.
Let me give you the kind of the 60-second overview. If I start to go too long, just reel me back in because you could get really in the weeds with this. But here is what basically happened. Okay. Is that the government had, in the 80s, in the 90s, they had some other mechanisms by which they were trying to see the safety complexion of a motor carrier on our public roads in the United States, right? But around in the early 2000s, the government decided, hey, we now technologically, we have all of these inspections and violation records of motor carriers that are on the road. Let's put together a methodology that will allow us to calculate something that tells us how safe a motor carrier is while they're on the highway, while they're on public roads, right?
And their intention for that was actually to inform the public. It had nothing to do with insurance.
The motoring public.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, their intention was to inform the motoring public of how safe these, 80,000-pound missiles are, that are passing them on the highway. And I completely understand that. So that's where they came from. That's a little bit of the history of it. There's more of it. The scores were available publicly in 2015 with the passage of the FAST Act. The public availability of the basic scores went away and those scores went dark. And
and that was really because the poor motoring public, as you said, not really having a good understanding of what to think of those scores, it actually was really hurtful to a lot of the motor carriers, right? And they realized, hey, our country relies on these trucking companies. They're the lifeblood of our economy.
Oh yeah,
we can't throw them all under the bus, or we're going to be in trouble. And so they just said, well, we'll just pull the scores away. Now, something we just skipped over there is for several years, with those scores being in publication in the market, the insurance companies and the whole insurance industry grasped onto those because that was really a key or one of the only standard benchmarks that existed for really being able to measure
the safety
a motor carrier's relative safety profile to other trucks on the road.
Right. And that's really important, because here's the thing. Everybody wants to be the standard, right? Every insurance company has their methodology with which they grade risk and measure safety. But the insurance industry gravitated towards the basic scores because arguably the government is a disinterested third party that is trying to find the truth of the safety and doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, on their methodology.
Yeah, so it really showed how, in my opinion, how much of a lack there was in the industry for really that benchmark or that global standard. The fact that everyone grasped onto and then started putting so much weight on these basic scores, which weren't even designed for insurance. Certainly they're valuable in getting a view into a risk profile, but as we'll get into throughout the episode here, there's definitely some pretty big gaps or some oddities when you're trying to look at the scores through an underwriting perspective or from a risk analysis perspective. There's definitely some gaps in there, and that context of understanding they weren't designed for insurance kind of helps bring some understanding to why that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, that was a little more than 60 seconds, but there you go. There's the history of where they originated from.
Okay, so our next question we want to jump into, which piggybacks right off of that, is what's the range for the basic scores? And what a fantastically insightful question to ask, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because if you don't know a range, then it's meaningless. Numbers on a page are meaningless if you don't have the context to wrap around why they should be meaningful. I think of the fact that, I can tell you that my daughter scored 5 goals in her soccer game, right? And you don't know to be happy or sad.
Yeah.
Because what is 5 goals? Well, if I tell you, well, the other team had 1 goal, then you're like, oh, wow, great. That's wonderful. But what if the other team has 72 goals? Well, then it's a totally different picture.
Different picture.
Yeah, you have to understand. Yeah, you got to have a frame of reference.
Oh, Ray, it reminds me of a sort of hilarious situation that happened a few weeks ago. My wife and I were out with the kids, and we were out with another family, eating at an outdoor venue, and there was live music there. And I got a couple of boys, so their friends were trying to get them to go dance to this music in this public space. Well, of course, they were embarrassed and didn't want to do it. So one of their friends said, I'll give you $5 to do it. Well, that wasn't still really going to move the needle. Well, my daughter, their older sister, steps up and very strategically says, I'll give you 200. Well, that motivated them. So of course they go perform
for 200.
So they perform, come running back to collect their 200, and she was so happy to deliver to them their 200 cents.
That is a really smart older sister. I'll just point that out.
Well, it almost started World War III. So, that's got to be taken into account as well. But yeah, it perfectly illustrates that if you don't have a framework for understanding the numbers you're talking about, then they really are meaningless, right? And not only meaningless, they can actually be dangerous because they can deceive you and give you
that play
a false
out
sense.
In our industry, where that absolutely happens. People are talking about scores and they think they're on the same page, and they are totally referring to different things.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack more of that as we go through here. So let's just focus on this one specifically. The range for the basic scores is what?
All right, so the range for the basic scores, the answer to that is wrapped up in the first few words of this definition. The basic scores are the percentile ranking of a motor carrier. What does that mean? That means a percentile ranking is 0 to 100. So there's your range.
Right. Has to be 0 to 100 because definitionally 100% is the maximum. That is the entire sample set.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Now, percentile rankings can be a little bit confusing as well, but the reality is, even though it's not called a percent, it's called a score. The basic score itself, that number value, is the percentile ranking, and that just comes through and gets used. The term that gets used is the score, but that score actually is the percent ranking.
Yeah.
So it's not an absolute value number. There's no underlying things that actually add up to that score. That score represents the percentile ranking.
Correct. And because it's a ranking, that is why people call it a score, because you are being scored against your peers. That's what a percentile ranking is. It's exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So this next question is going to help us unpack that a little bit more. The next question says, is the basic measure the same thing as the basic score?
Oh boy. It is not. That's the easy answer to that. But there
should we say buckle your seatbelts as we get into this one?
That's great. Yes. Buckle your seatbelt, because there are people out there that have the false assumption that the basic measure is akin to the basic score, and it is just simply not. And let me unpack it.
Yeah. What is the basic measure then, so we don't confuse it with the basic score?
The best way that I can illustrate this is to explain that the basic measure is just a simple calculation, taking just a motor carrier's violations and inspections into consideration with nothing else around them, right? As if they're the only motor carrier on the road. It's just a little math formula to add up the severity of the violations and the inspections that they actually have on the roadway. Just them.
Let me rephrase that and see if we can see if this makes sense. And together we'll see if we can bring as succinct of clarity to this as possible. So the basic measure is an actual number, not a percentile ranking. It is an actual number. And it is derived from underlying data of violations, once again, defined by the FMCSA. Within categories, because as we have on the screen in front of us here, the basic scores are split across 7 categories. So let me say this as well. Once again, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Make sure we get full clarity here. There is a basic measure underlying each of these basic scores, and that basic measure is an actual number that comes from violations or events that occurred within each of these categories. Is that an accurate statement?
That is an accurate statement. Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Now, I know you have some examples. Why don't you illustrate the difference between the basic measure and the basic score? Because if there's confusion here, this example will just blow that to smithereens.
If you get your understanding of the basic measures versus the basic scores wrong, you have the potential to make some really egregious errors that you will quickly discover, because it'll be embarrassing. So let me show you the basic measure and the basic score of a particular motor carrier. So I'm going to jump over to the DOT analysis platform and pull up a DOT report for a motor carrier. I'm on the summary tab. I'm going to scroll down, and I am looking at the basic scores, all 7 categories for this motor carrier. And I'm going to point out, if you're watching the stream on YouTube here, you can see this. I'm going to point out hours of service, which hours of service is one of those 7 categories in the basic scores, right? Mm-hmm. Well, this motor carrier has a 92 score in hours of service.
Okay, so just to restate then, they're in the 92nd percentile.
Right.
Only 8% of that category has worse hours of service score than them.
That is correct. And the percentile ranking for all these scores is the higher number is worse, because they're, like you said, the 92nd percentile worst motor carrier with out of service for the category of out of service.
Right. And the measurement is measuring violations and risk, if that's the right word to use. I cringe, because we've got to carefully define that, but it's measuring violations. So the higher percentile is worse, because we're not measuring safety, in which case the higher percentile would be better. We're measuring violations. The higher the number, the worse the offense.
Right. Violations are bad. No one wants to have violations. So this motor carrier has a 92 in the category of hours of service. So that information, the 92, that's not public, right? The methodology by which
since
to get
2015, right?
Yes, that's not public. The measure is public. And I'm going to jump over to
Well,
the,
okay, I'm sorry, Ray. I don't want to interrupt, but I feel like I have to clarify because we're showing the value. So we can get the number. It's not public, meaning the government is not freely offering that value and that number.
I'll say it this way, the information by which to derive the score is publicly available.
Oh, yeah. Do you have that? I mean,
I did save that. So this, get ready
oh
to,
boy.
let me throw that on the screen. This fantastic document, this is the Safety Measurement System SMS methodology. This is a 78-page document, last revised in June 2026 with a methodology revision of May 2026. This is what the government publishes. And if you want some really riveting reading that will for sure put you to sleep, go through and read the 78-page document. This is what the federal government publishes so that you can take all of the publicly available information and derive the genuine score of a motor carrier in each one of these basic categories. But the calculation itself.
I think I'd rather try and follow a map to the lost city of Atlantis than wade my way through this document.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Now, fortunately, we do have some members of our team who are phenomenal at this, and that's how we have the scores. And well, I don't know that I could make it through the 78 pages. It is the careful explanation of all of that data that gives us so much insight into this and allows us to be able to talk confidently about how these scores work and how each of these numbers work and why it's so important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is the intellectual firepower behind everything that we're talking about here. Absolutely.
All right. So I'm sorry I derailed us, but I want to make sure that we're building out this whole logical argument so everything we're saying makes sense. So we have the scores published because we are doing the calculation based on this massive document that explains how the government comes up with the score. But the score is not publicly available in the sense that the FMCSA no longer just publishes this basic score value in this case for hours of service, that 92. That's not publicly available from the FMCSA.
Right. A general member of the public or someone in the industry can't just go to the FMCSA and say, tell me what the hours of service score is for this motor carrier. This 92 doesn't exist publicly.
Okay. So now continue on with comparing that to the basic measure that we so rudely interrupted us from a minute ago.
That's all right. So this 92, while that's not publicly available, the underlying data for hours of service is publicly available, which includes the basic measure for hours of service, which is a number. I'm going to jump over to the FMCSA's SMS website here, Safety Measurement System. I already have this pulled up.
Publicly available. Anybody can go and see this number.
Anybody can go and see this information by going to fmcsa.dot.gov and clicking on SMS. Here is the hours of service category for the basic safety categories. This is the measure, 2.55.
So we use the term basic measure. Here it is right on the SMS website. The basic measure for the hours of service category is 2.55.
Right. Now think about it. If you are talking to someone and they do not have the understanding of the difference between basic measure and basic score, and you say to them, hey, this motor carrier has a score of 2.55, you'll go, wow, 2.55? That's great. They must be really safe. Well, but the real score, making that 2.55 meaningful, the only way to make it meaningful is to put it in that percentile ranking so that it is a ranking against their peers. What is it? It's at 92. What is 92? It's above alert threshold. Let me explain what alert threshold is here. An alert threshold is that line in the sand, so to speak, where the FMCSA defined, hey, we have a problem here. We want to point out that there is an alert going off in this category. It is, in this case, 65 is the threshold for being in alert status. So this motor carrier that is above the alert threshold of 65 for hours of service with a score of 92 is based off a measure of 2.55. So if you aren't talking with a framework to understand that basic measure of 2.55, it is a meaningless metric unless it is converted into a score.
Yeah,
How's
and
that?
boy, yeah, that's great. And we started with that definition of terms. That's why that leading question of what's the story with the scores is so telling of how confusing the topic is, because you can't use the word score.
Yeah, you
Someone
can't
could
say
say,
that.
like you just referenced, someone could make the quote unquote truthful statement that they have an hours of service score of 2.55. That's true in the sense that their basic measure score, the number value for the basic measure is 2.55. It's just completely differentiated from or distanced from the actual meaningful value of the basic score for hours of service, which would be the technical way to say that, correct? The basic score for hours of service is 92 for this motor carrier.
Right, which is a ranking of this motor carrier in that category against its peers, thereby making it meaningful. So instead of just saying, hey, my daughter got made 5 goals in the game, good, but tell me the rest of the story because I don't know whether or not to praise you or to say I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you got to tell the rest of the story. Oh, the other team had 70 goals. Sorry about that. That's a bummer. Or
Right.
so you have to have the full picture in order to have the information be meaningful. So if you're out there looking at basic measures, you got to
Yeah.
have the rest
And
of the picture.
oh man, that's a great point. I want to make sure we don't miss this either. Because the basic measures are publicly available and the basic scores are so difficult to come up with, there
Right.
are a variety of sites and platforms and resources out there that are publishing those measures and saying things like, we have the scores, or we have safety data or safety scores, or any of those terms. And man, if it is not clarified that those are actually the basic scores, you just need to understand that
Yeah.
it's a totally different category and be very careful to not confuse that with something that it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't confuse the basic measure for the basic score. And that is so valuable to understand.
I mean, you've seen this too, right? There's other people who take those basic measures. They realize that it's not that valuable, but they build their own analysis tool, come up
Yeah.
with their own,
Proprietary, they call it.
one of these throwaway words that they put around it. They're going to call it a DOT score or call it something like that and put it out there. And it's not exactly the basic score, but once again, there's not a defined or a widely accepted framework around it to understand it by, thereby making it, once again, essentially a worthless number and something distracting and confusing.
You got to be talking apples to apples with somebody if you're going to want to pull value from a score conversation on a motor carrier.
Okay, last thing I want to mention before we move on to the next question. You referenced the alert status there. I just want to add a little more clarity to that and make sure we don't miss this.
Sure.
Once again, because this is related to the basic scores, which is an FMCSA derivative, the FMCSA is the one who defines that status. So it is not specifically an insurance defined threshold. Just another important thing to know. However, it is something that many underwriters look at as a benchmark. And so someone being in alert, which just means they're above that threshold line.
That's set by the FMCSA. That's right.
Yep. Is a key thing by which many underwriters do look at to rate risk or sometimes to disqualify motor carriers.
You say underwriters, and that's absolutely true. But there are appetite guides that have criteria in them about basic scores and being at or above the threshold for different categories.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it's that great apples to apples comparison and conversation that can be applied across the industry to any motor carrier because it's the government, this third party, actually doing that rating.
So one kind of interesting thing that I want to note about this, though, because the score is a percentile ranking, and because that line, that alert threshold, is defined by the FMCSA, there is actually not a specific underlying event or status or actual risk profile that exists that defines this puts you in alert. It actually is just that there is always going to be a certain percent, because this is a percentile ranking and they're saying everyone above this percentile is in alert, there's
Right.
always a subset of motor carriers, regardless of their underlying data, that is going to be in that alert status. So
Yeah.
just an interesting thing to point out, and we don't have time to dig into all of this today, but our DOT analysis platform does have the ability to unpack and see all of the underlying data behind these scores, which is really valuable in understanding the true risk profile and not just that relative rating. So
Correct.
I wanted to make sure to clarify that as well so that there's more clarity around what that alert status really means and the different ways that you can utilize it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, should we move on to the next question?
Sure.
All right. Oh, this is a great one. You're going to love this one, Ray. Does a score of 0 mean that the motor carrier doesn't have violations in that category?
Oh, yeah. That is a really, really commonly asked question, or I'd say it's a commonly perceived question, because you look at a score and you would think that if you have a 0 or no score, which people interpret as a 0, you look at that and you think, oh, good, there's no violations there. They're clean in that category. The answer to that is no, not necessarily, right?
Yeah, could be. And that's
Could
what makes
be.
it confusing.
Yeah, could be, but not necessarily. So I'm gonna do this. I'm going to pull up another motor carrier here in the DOT analysis platform so that we can illustrate this. So check this out. I'm going to put in a DOT number here, and we'll pull them up. Here we go. I'm on the DOT report for another motor carrier. I'm going to scroll down and look at their basic scores. And look, they have a 37 in hours of service, and they have a 48 in vehicle maintenance. But that means crash, unsafe driving, controlled substance, driver fitness, hazmat, no score or 0.
All zeros. Yep.
So, yeah. So now let's dig into that, right? And if I click on the Insights tab inside of a DOT report, I can actually dig into understanding these motor carriers' scores. Check this out. Unsafe driving. Remember what we had? A 0 score or no score. You would make the assumption, oh, good, they're clean. No unsafe driving issues. Look what we have here. We actually have 45 different inspections resulting in one violation where seatbelt, the guy was not, or the driver was not wearing a seatbelt. That's a driver activity issue. You would want to know as an underwriter, or you would want to know as a safety manager, or you would want to know as a trusted advisor, that agent, right? Absolutely important to be able to have that. So does that answer that question well?
Yeah, I think so. So just to clarify, there's multiple cases in which someone might have a 0, or that could indicate a number of things that could be true. It could mean that they legitimately have a score of 0, meaning they really don't have violations in that category.
Yep.
Or once again, in that huge 80-page document, there is a threshold before which a score gets calculated. There has to be enough data in the system. So sometimes there's just not enough data in the system. There's violations there, but not enough underlying data for them to be included in the scoring mechanism. That's another reason why someone could have that 0, right?
Yep, absolutely. So don't look at that 0 as a absolute guarantee that there are no violations in that category for that motor carrier. You have to have a tool that will allow you to look at that category and brush past the assumption that the FMCSA's scoring mechanism oftentimes causes people to draw.
Yeah. And Ray, one of the terms we like to use is magic 0 for that, which is when you have violations there, but you still have a score of 0, that we use the term magic 0, meaning those violations magically turn into a score of 0.
Right.
And interestingly enough, this is really not that uncommon, where there's violations that exist in a category, but the threshold for calculating a score for them has not been met. And then a certain thing happens.
A threshold that's set by the FMCSA, I'll point out.
Right. And which is oftentimes related to just a number of inspections. So before they're going to get entered into the scoring mechanism to receive a percentile ranking, they can all of a sudden meet that threshold where all of a sudden now they're included in that calculation, and they don't go into a minimal score. You don't just move up
Yeah.
gradually through this system necessarily.
Right.
There's times when someone goes from a 0 score all the way into alert status in one event.
Right. In one monthly calculation, which that layers onto a little bit more of a understanding of here, is that these scores are calculated on a monthly basis, right?
Yeah, so there's roughly 30 days worth of data that's going to go into each score calculation.
Right.
And well, we'll unpack that whole thing in a second here in another question. But yeah, the point being that you can definitely have violations in a category, and that can actually result in catapulting into a high score from 0 right up to a high score in some cases. And so understanding the underlying data, even behind a 0, is really important. Whatever framework you're looking at this from, producer, underwriter,
Right.
or motor
Absolutely.
carrier.
Super important.
Okay, let's move on to the next one here. Oh, this is another really interesting question. Can I predict how a motor carrier's scores will change when certain violations fall off their record? And man, a great question.
Yeah, there's so much that's baked into that.
And a few context things I think we need to set up before we fully answer this. So when someone asks that, what do they mean? Let's explain first of all, what do they mean when they say the violations fall off their record?
So the way that each one of these basic categories, the basic scores work, is that the FMCSA is looking at the last 24 months. So call it the last 2 years of violations and inspections for the motor carrier. So there's the context to understand what someone means when they say when that violation falls off their record. What they're saying is when that violation is older than 2 years, it'll no longer be included in the calculation that the FMCSA's methodology causes it to be calculated in.
Okay, so that's great context. And then just a second ago, you mentioned that this recalculation is happening on a monthly basis.
Yep.
So that's the other context that's helpful to understand why someone would want to predict a score. Because if these were getting recalculated daily, there'd be no need to predict it. You would know every day what it is. But people are wanting to look ahead and try and skip that 30-day waiting period for the next score, or 60 days for 2 scores out, and go, well, what's going to happen when we get here? Because I have to wait for that recalculation to get done, right?
That's one reason. There's another reason, though, why people, and sometimes what people want to do is they will want to manipulate the underlying data, and they'll say, well, if we wouldn't have had this truck and this VIN isn't in there, or if we wouldn't have had that driver and that driver's behavior wasn't surfaced in the score, or if this or if that. And that is a really dangerous thing to do, because that score, understanding what it is and how it's created, is a percentile ranking. If you are going to try to inject a hypothesis like that, there are so many variables, not only about that motor carrier, but about all of the different peers in that motor carrier's safety event group, that
that changes the picture.
It changes the picture entirely.
Okay, so let's just look once again very technically at the question. The question, can I predict how a motor carrier scores would change when certain violations fall off the record? Technically, because this is a math formula, technically the answer to that is yes.
You can do that.
You manipulate the data going in, you change the basic measure that's being used in the formula, and you can come up with a theoretical placement in that percentile ranking.
Right.
Now, what you were just saying, though, about the danger is, but once you actually get to that point, tons of other variables have also changed, and many of those variables outside of that specific motor carrier's control, because it's influenced by the activities and the occurrences of all of the other motor carriers in their peer group.
It is a very dangerous thing from both perspectives. And when I say both perspectives, I mean from the agent's perspective, it's very dangerous because everyone knows that an agent is a good agent, especially, is great at painting a rosy picture about a motor carrier who carries a lot of risk, right? And that is a dangerous thing to do because you can manipulate statistics. You can manipulate things in any way. So it's in my opinion, it's very dangerous to try and do that and
Oh
paint too
man.
rosy of a picture because it degrades the quality with which that underwriter who's working with you to try to price that premium, it degrades their ability to trust what you're saying oftentimes.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy that comes to mind for me would be when you hear the weather forecast and you hear, like, oh, it's supposed to be 75 degrees tomorrow. And you think,
Yeah.
oh, well, that sounds fantastic, But the context can make a whole lot of difference for that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if it's cloudy and windy, that might feel cold and you're going to need a sweatshirt. If it's sunny and humid as can be,
Right.
that could feel like 100 degrees to you, right? And so the context for that makes so much difference in how you actually understand what that means. And yeah, I think that illustrates part of why this is so dangerous to try and manipulate those scores.
Just to send that point home, you bring to mind something that is, does anyone ever read the Babylon Bee? It is
Oh, I love the Babylon Bee.
the Babylon Bee is so great. They're a satire website, satire news. And I live in Michigan. And so we have a lot of humidity in our heat, right? And that's always juxtaposed with people that are, out in, an arid place where you might have heat, but they always say, oh, it's like it's not so humid as Michigan, so we don't mind the heat. Well,
Right.
let me see. I think I have this. Check this out. I do. It's right here. This is an article from the Babylon Bee who says, yeah, but it's a dry heat, says an Arizona man who is currently on fire. So it's all about perspective, right?
Yeah, I mean that's like the agent who's like, "Oh, this picture's pretty rosy," so to the motor carrier's on fire.
Exactly. So
It all depends how you want to frame something up.
it all depends on how you want to frame something up. So to answer that question specifically, because it is one that we will occasionally get, can you predict the motor carrier's score? Well, yeah, you can predict anything. You can change the underlying data. And in this case, this is a math formula. It's a very complicated algorithmic formula. You can change the data and you can make a prediction. But is it valuable to make the prediction? And what's the use case for that prediction? So be careful in that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are some tools out there because people want to do that, the temptation to do that. There are some tools out there for it. We do not have one of those tools baked into the DOT analysis platform, and not because it would be difficult to do, but just it can be so distracting and confusing
thing to do.
Yeah. So we have a very high standard for truth within this platform. And, that doesn't quite meet it for us.
It kind of grates against that.
Yeah. Okay. We got time for one more question here before we wrap up,
Sure.
Ray. All right.
Yep.
And this is so clarifying because we have spent the majority of this episode now talking about the basic scores, which totally valid because that is the number one scoring mechanism that's used. But this last question asks, how is the ISS score different than the basic score?
Oh, yeah.
Once again, what a fantastic question because there are legitimate scoring methods and systems other than the basic scores, and the ISS score is one of those. In fact, those are probably the two main or primary scoring mechanisms. But have important differences.
I want to point out a word you said there because it's really important. You said legitimate. And I think the reason you just used the word legitimate to reference the ISS score is because it is coming from the same place that the basic scores came from, the FMCSA, the U.S. Department of Transportation. So it is that same third party that is putting in place a methodology by which to calculate this score. So yeah, ISS score comes from the FMCSA as well.
All right. So why don't we look at that definition and then explain how that contrasts with the basic score?
All right. I'm going to jump back over to our glossary of terms here, and I'm going to search ISS. And here we go. I have ISS score in the glossary of terms here on dotanalysis.com. And ISS stands for Inspection Selection System. And let me explain how that name is really informative of exactly what this is. Because it is a where the rubber meets the road reality for motor carriers in the industry. The inspection selection system is a mechanism that's used by the government to identify motor carriers that are literally going down the road of who they need to inspect, who they need to flag down, who they need to pull over and inspect that vehicle and that driver. So it is a 0 to 100 rating assigned to trucking companies by the FMCSA, calculated from a motor carrier's safety violations and inspection results and their crash data, and, like I was saying, used by inspectors and bypass systems to decide in real time whether a truck should get pulled over for inspection. So this is really meaningful to motor carriers because their daily operations intersects with the reality of what their ISS score is.
All right, so let me compare and contrast a few of the things you just said there with the basic scores, because I want to make sure we avoid confusion. This is also a 0 to 100 rating, just like the basic scores are.
Right.
However, it does not have categories like the basic scores. So it is a little bit differentiated from that, although that is still the framework for the score, is that 0 to 100. Now, we're not going to unpack this in as much detail as we did the basic scores, but suffice it to say that this rating system is prioritizing and taking into account the specific types of events and violations that the FMCSA deems is most able to be addressed roadside. Is that the actual verbiage that they use?
Yeah, the actual verbiage they use is it is dealing with violations that are best addressed roadside. And that's why it has a rubber meets the road reality. And that's why it's used to identify vehicles that are traveling on the highway, on public roads, that need more inspection. And I'll say it this way. The ISS score is a bubbling up of and simplification of all of those basic categories.
Okay, so generally the same underlying data set as being used to calculate the basic scores. So in some ways, it is a more genericized version of the basic scores,
Correct.
Although with some important differences, because like we said, this scoring system is prioritizing those things that can be addressed roadside, because that is their goal with inspections, is to address things roadside. So it's prioritizing that, but it is drawing from that same data, and having higher basic scores is going to be correlated with having a higher ISS score as a broad rule.
As a general rule.
Generally true,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
So talk about the three categories here. ISS score is broken up into three categories. Can you just quickly cover what those categories are and what they mean practically?
Sure. Yeah. So we have listed on here three categories: red, yellow, green. And most people in the industry know there is a red category, a yellow category, and a green category. And I will just point out, it is possible for there to be such little data that the government has on a motor carrier that they don't have an ISS score. So,
and that literally is stated as, is it stated as insufficient data?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. That's what that's listed as.
But commonly, you mentioned those red, yellow, green categories. That's the terminology that's generally used is, oh, they're red ISS, or, oh, they're green ISS, right? That's
correct.
The industry terminology that's most commonly used.
Yes. And then within that, there is a score that the motor carrier will have. So if you're in red, if you're a red ISS, that means your score is between 75 and 100. If you are yellow ISS, that means your score is between 50 and 74. If you are green ISS, that means your score is between 0 and 49. So there are numbers to go with that. But oftentimes in the industry, people, will refer to the color first. They'll say, oh, we don't write anyone that's red ISS, or we only will call on motor carriers that are green ISS, or our appetite guide allows for some yellow ISS, things like that.
Okay, so that's perfect then. Explain why the practical implication of that and why that matters, why that would influence the appetite guide.
So here's what oftentimes happens. And I'm going to go back to that concept that the ISS score is very meaningful to a motor carrier because it's where the rubber meets the road. Motor carriers, especially fleets, are very aware of their ISS score because here's what happens. If a motor carrier is red ISS, for example,
and if they pull into a weigh station, what happens?
Yeah, if they are red, then the inspector, the DOT officer who's seeing that truck is obliged to pull them aside and do a full inspection. So
hence that terminology for that category is red inspect.
correct, because they are obliged to inspect that vehicle with more thoroughness. They can't just say, "Oh, sorry, go ahead." Now, if they're green, that is the go ahead category, because it says
hence the term pass for the green category.
Exactly. They just pass on through. Now we get to the middle ground, optional. That is, it's at the inspector's discretion, the officer's discretion. They can say, hey, I got a little extra time. I'm going to pull them in. I'll wave them in and I'll do a fuller inspection. So here's what's fascinating. What happens? You get into that yellow, or especially that red score, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more times you're inspected, the more likely that a officer or an inspector is going to find an issue with your truck or with your logbook or whatever it might be. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to get out of red once you are in red, but it does become harder, statistically speaking, because there are more inspections being levied against you.
Yeah, it definitely can become that self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, so that's really good to know. And it's also really good for people to be aware of how important the ISS score is to a fleet and the safety manager at that fleet, because that's going to have a real world operational effect on them today, this week. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that totally explains then why underwriting guides would sometimes have, or appetite guides would have, wanting to not have red in their book, for example, because of the inherent additional risk that is carried with the motor carrier, not to mention the fact that whatever that underlying data is that's rolling up into that red score is obviously a potential problem as well.
Yep. And again, I'll point out, not every appetite guide and not every underwriting guideline. There are plenty of underwriting outfits out there that specialize in hairier or riskier or red ISS motor carriers, because they set the premium accordingly.
Right. And as we say all the time, we are not trying to say whether things are good or bad here. We're trying to just provide context information for what all of the data means, so that you can then utilize it in the way that's most meaningful to you, whatever role you fit in this industry.
Yep, absolutely. That's very important to us.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and wrap up this conversation today. Those of you who have made it with us to the end, way to go. You're a true warrior, and you really care about your clients and your job. And that's fantastic that you want to do the best job you can by your customers and for your company, and understanding all this data is so helpful. We say this all the time too, but please continue to give us your feedback. If there's other branches of this conversation or other topics related to this that you wish we would have covered, let us know that, and we will see about trying to get those in on another episode in the near future.
All right. Until next time, you guys have a great weekend. We'll see you next time.
Scene, right to party, let's all move together to the sound.